Okay, let's unpack this. We've been given sources on a personal injury case, Murry v. Witherel.
Hmm.
And this is one of those scenarios that just feels fundamentally wrong. The jury finds the defendant is 100% at fault for these catastrophic, life-changing injuries.
Right, we're talking spinal fusion surgery.
Exactly. And then they turn around and award an amount of compensation that just looks absurdly low. I mean, we're talking $25,000 for years of post-surgical suffering.
It's a number that makes you stop and think.
So the core legal problem for you, the learner, is to really get a handle on the precise standard a court uses when it has to decide whether to step in and tell a jury you got the dollar amount completely wrong.
That's the heart of it. And for this deep dive, we really have to dissect two powerful but very different standards of judicial review.
Okay.
The critical insight here is that the law treats a jury's finding on a fact totally differently than its finding on money. So first, we'll look at the extremely high bar for overturning a jury's factual finding, like, was an injury legally serious? Then we'll shift to the second standard, which is a bit less deferential, and it's applied specifically to the money, the damages, to determine if the award is legally inadequate.
Right.
We have to walk through the Murry facts element by element to see how this plays out.
Let's start with the facts of the accident itself. The plaintiff, Thela Murry, was rear-ended by the defendant Witherel back in 1997. The jury found Witherel was 100% responsible, no question there.
The liability is clear.
Right. So after that, the jury had to decide if Murry suffered a serious injury under the insurance law. They did agree on one category, permanent consequential limitation of use. But the plaintiff argued they were wrong about another category, specifically significant disfigurement. So before we get into the details of her scar, what is the fundamental rule a court uses to set aside a jury's verdict on a factual finding like that?
Okay, so the general rule here is what we call the weight of evidence standard. And the rule is simple to say, but incredibly difficult to meet.
How so?
The standard is just exceptionally deferential to the jury. A verdict can only be set aside if, and I'm quoting here, the evidence so preponderated in favor of the plaintiff that the verdict could not have been reached on any fair interpretation of the evidence.
Any fair interpretation. That sounds like a lot of leeway for the jury.
A huge amount. That phrase really shows how much the law respects the jury's role. They were in the room, they saw the witnesses, they weighed the evidence themselves. This rule basically enshrines them as the ultimate decider of fact.
So the question becomes, did the evidence for a significant disfigurement so overwhelmingly favor Murry that the jury's decision against it just couldn't be considered fair? Let's analyze Murry v. Witherel on this point. First, what were the legally dispositive facts about this disfigurement?
The facts were very concrete. The plaintiff had scarring from her treatment in two places. First, a surgical scar on her neck from the actual spinal fusion. And second, a scar on her hip. That was the donor site where they took bone for the graft. But the key fact, the one the court really focused on, was that the jury had the opportunity to physically view the plaintiff's neck scar and also a photo of the hip scar during the trial.
They saw the evidence firsthand, and what was the core legal issue regarding that finding?
The precise question for the appellate court was whether the trial court, the first court, made a mistake by setting aside the jury's initial decision that Murray's scars did not rise to the level of a significant disfigurement.
So what rule of law did the court apply to even define what a significant disfigurement is? Can you state the full rule and break it down for us?
Absolutely. The rule for significant disfigurement is all about external perception, not the person's internal pain. The test is whether the condition would be regarded by a reasonable person as unattractive, objectionable, or as the subject of pity or scorn.
Okay, so there are elements there.
Right. Three testable elements. First, is it unattractive? Second, is it objectionable? And third, is it a subject of pity or scorn? The scar has to meet at least one of those as judged by a reasonable observer.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this. How did the appellate division apply those first two elements, unattractive or objectionable, to the facts of the scars?
Well, the court's whole analysis came down to that one fact, the personal viewing. Because the jury, who are acting as that reasonable person, had personally seen the scars, their finding that they were not unattractive or objectionable was, by definition, supported by a fair interpretation of the evidence.
So the jury seeing it is the evidence.
Essentially, yes.
Uh,
The court basically said that just because you have a surgical scar, even from a major surgery, that doesn't automatically make it a legal disfigurement if the jury looks at it and decides its appearance is acceptable. the jury rendered a factual opinion that it just wasn't that bad.
That makes a lot of sense. The jury saw it, they made a judgment call, and the court isn't going to second-guess them unless the evidence was just completely overwhelming. But what about that third, most severe element of the test, being the subject of pity or scorn?
The evidence didn't come close to that standard. I mean, to be the subject of pity or scorn, a disfigurement has to be so severe that it provokes an extreme negative public reaction.
And since the jury already said it wasn't even unattractive.
Exactly. Since the jury, who represents that reasonable public, looked at the evidence and found it didn't even meet those lower standards, it naturally couldn't meet the highest standard. The policy here is that unless a scar is truly, monstrous, the court has to trust the jury's direct observation.
So after analyzing all of those elements under that very deferential weight of evidence standard, what was the court's final conclusion on the disfigurement issue?
The appellate division concluded that the lower court had made an error by setting aside the verdict on that point. The jury's original factual finding was reinstated. The plaintiff just hadn't proven the evidence so heavily favored her that the verdict couldn't be reached on any fair interpretation. That high bar just wasn't met.
Okay, so this is where the legal ground shifts completely. We're moving from a factual question, is the scar significant, to a monetary one. Is the compensation adequate?
Right.
While the appellate court restored the jury's finding on the fact of disfigurement, they agreed with the trial court that the damages awarded were just totally unacceptable. This really highlights the difference between the two standards. So what is the standard for reviewing a monetary award, and why is it a lower bar?
This is the material deviation standard. The general rule is that to overturn a damages award, the court has to determine whether it deviates materially from what would be reasonable compensation.
Deviates materially.
Yes, and this is a lower bar than the weight of evidence standard. The reason it's lower is because putting a dollar value on human suffering is, inherently subjective. So the courts have built up a history of benchmarks through similar prior cases. This standard actually requires the court to compare the award to those established precedents.
That makes sense. You need some kind of objective anchor. Now, let's revisit just how severe Murray's injuries were, because that's crucial for establishing what reasonable compensation even looks like. She had multiple disc herniations in her neck and lower back after conservative care failed. We're talking painful epidural injections that left her bedridden. She had that anterior cervical discectomy and fusion surgery. Her own surgeon tied all of it directly to that 1997 accident.
A very serious set of injuries.
So let's start with the first damage component, past pain and suffering. The jury awarded $25,000 for the entire period leading up to the trial. This covers years of pain, the failed treatments, and a massive spinal fusion. How did the court use that material deviation rule to say $25,000 wasn't enough?
The court saw that $25,000 award as palpably inadequate. I mean, for the pre-surgical pain, the surgery itself, and the recovery from a cervical fusion. Their method was strictly comparative. They determined it deviated materially by measuring it against verdicts in similar cases.
Okay, so give us that comparison data. What were the benchmarks the court used to show how far off this award was?
They cited 3 key cases from around that time, 2001, that really established the reasonable range. First, they pointed to Miranda v. New Dimension Realty Co.
What happened there?
In that case, an award of $100,000 for past pain and suffering after a spinal fusion was found to be inadequate. The appellate court increased it 4 times over to $400,000. So that sets a pretty strong floor.
Wow.
Second, they looked at Smith v. Monroe Muffler Brake. There, a plaintiff with a herniated disc needing surgery got $50,000. Again, the reviewing court said that was inadequate and raised it also to $400,000.
So we're seeing a pattern here.
A very clear one. And finally, they noted Roundtree v. Manhattan and Bronx Surface TR Operating Auth, which affirmed a large award of $450,000 for similar injuries. So when you hold Murray's $25,000 award up against benchmarks in the $400,000 to $450,000 range, it's undeniably outside the bounds of reasonable. The math makes the inadequacy obvious.
That numerical disparity is staggering. It really proves the value of having this material deviation standard. Now let's look at future pain and suffering. The jury gave $10,000, but only for 18 months. This seems like a logical flaw, given that they also found she had a permanent injury and a life expectancy of over 40 years.
It's a huge logical flaw, and that's a specific kind of material deviation internal inconsistency. The court asked the exact same question you just did.
Which is?
How could a finding of a permanent consequential limitation of use possibly coexist with an award that's limited to only 18 months? The duration has no rational relationship to the injury the jury themselves found. It just doesn't make sense.
So it's irreconcilable.
Completely. The 18-month limit contradicts the finding of permanence, and it contradicts the 40.5-year life expectancy. So the court was compelled to set that award aside entirely.
Okay, finally, let's tackle future medical expenses. The jury awarded $15,000. This seems like it should be the easiest one to measure, since medical costs are based on actual estimates. What was the specific evidence here?
You're right. This is the most quantifiable part. The analysis was just simple arithmetic. The only evidence presented on future medical costs was testimony from her surgeon.
And what did he say?
He testified that she would likely need a second major surgery, a lumbar spine fusion, to deal with the other affected vertebrae. The estimated cost for that one single procedure was about $26,000.
So they awarded $15,000 for a procedure that was estimated to cost $26,000.
Exactly. Because the jury's award was less than the cost of the single likely procedure that the uncontroverted medical testimony established, the court had no choice but to find the award inadequate.
So, to wrap up the whole case, the appellate court fixed the lower court's error on the disfigurement issue, respecting that high weight of evidence standard for facts. But it affirmed that the low damage awards for past pain, and future medicals were properly thrown out because they materially deviated from reasonable compensation.
That's the perfect summary. A tale of two standards.
Okay, so let's synthesize this.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this case gives us a perfect diagnostic checklist for looking at a jury verdict where the amount just seems wrong.
A checklist, I like that.
When you're analyzing a verdict, you have to split the issue into two bins. Step 1. Is the finding about a factual element like liability or, like in this case, whether an injury is serious? If it is, you apply that highly deferential evidence, so preponderated standard. The bar for reversal is incredibly high.
Almost impossible to meet.
Almost. Then step 2 is the finding about the dollar amount of compensation. If so, you apply these deviates materially from reasonable compensation standard, that's a lower bar, and it requires you to explicitly compare the award to established legal benchmarks in similar cases to show that disparity.
That is a really powerful and clear tool for issue spotting. We saw awards from the early 2000s set aside as inadequate when they were only $25,000 for past pain after a spinal fusion. The court used cases from that same era to show that reasonable compensation was closer to $400,000. So here's something for you to mull over as you continue your own deep dive. Given medical inflation, cost of living increases, and just the general escalation of these benchmarks over the last 2 decades, what would be the modern equivalent of reasonable compensation for a plaintiff who went through that same surgery today?
That's a fascinating question.
The magnitude of that change is something truly worth exploring.